Welcome. How you doing? I'm Greg Roskopf, and I'm the owner of Muscle Activation Techniques. And wanted to talk today. Today we're going to go through a little topic. A muscle activation technique perspective of glute and abdominal training. You think about it. I started out my career as a strength and conditioning coach, and you think about it in the sports and performance world, let alone the exercise world. People are trying to strengthen their glutes and abdominals. If you had to say what would be the main areas that people are trying to train and strengthen in the exercise realm, you'd have to say it's probably glutes and abdominals. From a muscle tone standpoint, to a strength and performance standpoint, and even from especially core training relative to low back pain and dealing with back issues. I think the core stability is a key concept behind what we're looking for when we're trying to prevent or improve people's issues with low back pain. And so what we're going to do today is kind of take a look at the perspective and see, probably one of the things that jumps out at me is the owner and developer of muscle activation techniques, is one of the most common areas where I find neuromuscular weaknesses is in the glutes and abdominals. And so it's kind of contradictory. It's well, this is the area that most people are training, but from a neuromuscular standpoint, this is the area that I'm finding the greatest amount of weakness and vulnerabilities in. And so we have to take a step back and look at what are we actually doing, and is the process that we're going through actually adequate when we're trying to allow us to achieve what we're trying to achieve in our glute and abdominal training. So first, I'm just going to talk about muscle activation technique. Your muscle activation techniques, basically we look at whenever you have stress, trauma, or overuse, the resultant inflammation alters the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system. So it's like having loose battery cables. The brain sends the messages just don't get to the muscles, and literally then they can't do their job. They can't contract on demand, so they can't do their job to stabilize joints and protect us from injury. And this happens when you have inflammation. It lowers the threshold. And an example that I always use is if somebody was to sprain an ankle. You think about if you sprain an ankle, it's like, oh, I can't put any weight on it. I can't walk. And so basically the ankle sprain, the ligament's been sprained, but the muscles that support the joint are what got damaged. One of the main concerns, because ligaments don't have the contractile capability to stabilize joints. Muscles do. And so when the muscles get overloaded and inflamed in an ankle sprain, the inflammation negatively affects the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system. So the force tolerance levels are lower. So you try and walk on it, and it's like, this hurts. And well, it hurts because the muscles are weak. And when the muscles are weak, it takes less physical stress to create a pain response. So it can't tolerate the forces of body weight, ground reaction force. It basically can't handle the forces being placed on it after the tissue's been injured. Well, that transfers throughout the body. All muscles, when they get overloaded or inflamed, their tolerance levels become lower. And the first sign of muscle dysfunction is you get tight, protective tightening. The second sign is if you keep putting forces on those tissues, they shout out in pain, saying, quit doing this, quit putting forces on this tissue until you fix the problem. So when muscles can't contract efficiently, when you have this altered communication between the nervous system and the muscle system, when muscles can't contract efficiently, they can't shorten efficiently. When they can't shorten effectively through reciprocal inhibition, the opposite muscles tighten up. And so it's a protective tightness on the opposite side of the weak muscles. And so many times when we look at muscle tightness, we think, oh, we need to loosen this up. I had a fractured vertebrae when I was young, and the common theme of every practitioner that I sought out was, you're tight. The reason you're having all of these residual issues, I had patellofemoral syndrome, plantar fasciitis, one injury after another. The reason you're having all these residual issues is because you're tight. And every modality focused on trying to release the tightness, when actually my problem was the weakness. And ironically, as we're going to move into core training, Actually, I had the trauma to my lower back. My abdominal wall and the core was weak. The inflammation related to the fractured vertebrae made the muscles that support the spine weak, and with those muscles being weak, I had chronic pain. And then my body had to compensate for those weaknesses. And like I said, the next thing I know, I have patellofemoral syndrome, plantar fasciitis, SI joint dysfunction, just one injury after another. And literally by the time I was 25 years old, I was like, man, if I'm this bad at 25, what am I going to be like when I'm 50? And so something was wrong. I was a strength and conditioning coach. We were doing core training. We were doing a lot of strength training, but I was in chronic pain. And so there was something wrong with the work that I was doing. And like I said, my abdominals were weak. I didn't know it because I was doing all the abdominal work in the world to try and strengthen my core. But from a neurological standpoint, I basically never reestablished the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system. And I ended up basically having chronic pain for years. And the problem was, like I said, is everyone was focusing on the tightness, but the tightness wasn't the problem. The weakness was the problem. And when you have stress, trauma, or overuse, the resultant inflammation alters the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system. And so those muscles can't contract efficiently, they can't shorten effectively. If they can't shorten effectively, then they can't do their job to stabilize joints and protect you from injury. So the opposite muscles tighten up, just like when you walk on ice. If you think about when you walk on ice, your body tightens up as a protective mechanism. The natural neurological response is that when the body senses instability, it tightens up as a protective mechanism. So whether that instability is from an external surface, i.e. walking on ice, or from an intrinsic mechanism, i.e. muscle weakness due to overinflammation, the body goes into a protective state. And so basically, the body loses its ability to move into the extremes of range of motion. The extremes of range of motion are where the muscles can't contract efficiently, which means they can't tolerate forces in those extremes of range of motion. And so we have to teach the body to move. When we have injuries, we have to teach the body to move through its full ranges of motion. And so what happens, like I said, when the body protects and it tightens up, we avoid those positions. We avoid those extremes of range of motion. That's what we're going to talk about with the conventional glute and abdominal training, is do we actually challenge the body through its full ranges of motion, or do we accommodate the dysfunction by training it in the ranges that it's comfortable in? And we'll give you a whole different perspective on muscle function and how to strengthen muscles to make them more functional. Because the whole key is when you have muscle dysfunction, that whole idea, if you don't use it, you lose it. If you don't train muscles through their full ranges of motion and you abbreviate ranges of motion, you're going to lose the efficiency of muscle contraction. And so that's basically what we're going to look at here as we talk about glute and abdominal training. So again, inflammation alters the communication. Muscles can't shorten. The opposite muscles tighten up. The interesting thing is, I'm going into my 25th year with the Denver Broncos this year, and I've been in pro sports for over 30 years, working with the Utah Jazz and then the Denver Nuggets here in Denver. And the interesting thing is how often guys come in training camp and their abdominals and their glutes are shut down. I mean, inhibited due to overuse, overstress. And the overuse and overstress means they're not prepared to tolerate the forces that are being placed on them. And that's when they come in with hamstring strains or groin issues or low back pain. They come in with various complaints relative to pain, but the dysfunction is the weakness in the muscles. And you see some of these guys, some of these big athletes, they lie down on the table and they lie face down and their butt can be huge. I mean, it's like, how can somebody have weak glutes when the size of and the mass that they have? But it's actually how they're trained. And I think that's the biggest key. You can have strength, but that doesn't mean you have stability. So if you strengthen your muscles through mid-ranges of motion, you can have strength, but it doesn't mean you have stability. And the stability shows up through the extremes of range of motion. Muscles have to be able to contract through the extremes of range of motion. And many times these people are tight in their hip flexors because the glutes can't fully shorten because they've been overloaded. So they have these big, strong glutes, but they can't work through their full ranges of motion, and the opposite muscles tighten up. So that you got these tight hip flexors in this anterior pelvic tilt, the lordosis, the lower cross syndrome. It's because the glutes and abdominals are weak and the hip flexors and erectors are tight, just doing everything they can to protect. So how do you make the glutes and abdominals a key component of strength to balance out the body and balance out posture? If you have a lower cross syndrome with the anterior pelvic tilt and lumbar lordosis, it's because the muscles that are pulling you into spinal extension and anterior pelvic tilt are dominated. The hip flexors and erectors pull while the glutes and abdominals can't counterpull. They can't create a counter force to resist that pull. So we have to train our body to understand that. So we know that the body will protect us from moving into the extremes of range of motion when we have weaknesses. And so we need to actually teach the body, kind of reestablish neuromuscular function when you have these weaknesses. Because the first sign of muscle dysfunction, like I said, is tightness. The second sign is pain. And pain typically shows up in the extremes of range of motion. People don't sit here and say, you know, I hurt my back doing this. They say, I hurt my back when I bent down to pick up my child, or I hurt my back when I went to lift the weights and in the extremes of range of motion, or I was swinging a golf club and I tweaked my back. The pain typically shows up in the extremes of range of motion. When I go through range of motion assessment, people, okay, I take them into external rotation and say, oh yeah, that hurts. Well, not only does it hurt, but it's tight. Tightness is the first sign of muscle dysfunction. Pain is the second. You keep putting force on those tissues in the extreme of range of motion, the body's shouting out saying, don't do this until you fix the problem. So the body reverts toward neutral. It reverts toward its center of gravity. You think about when you walk on ice. What do? You tighten up, you shorten your stride length, you shorten your arm swing, and you revert yourselves toward your center of gravity, because that's a position of stability. So think about that. The position of stability, we revert when we're dysfunctional from a neuromuscular standpoint, we revert ourselves toward our center of gravity. When we do spinal neutral training, when we try and train the core, the key factors, hold your spine in neutral, lift your legs, lift your arms, do bridging, do all these movements trying to maintain a neutral spine position. We don't function in neutral. The neutral position is the position we revert to when we're dysfunctional. We're stable in the neutral position. We're not stable in the extremes of range of motion. So part of compensation of the body is to say, I don't want to move in the extremes of range of motion, so I'm going to encompass myself and then revert myself back toward my center of gravity. Well, that's the position we revert to when we're dysfunctional, because that's the position where we're the most stable. So if we're doing spinal neutral training and we're not teaching the body to also move, I mean, that's a great position to start from because that's where we're the strongest. But we have to teach the body to move, because the minute you get out of neutral, when you bend over to pick up your child or lift the weight and you get out of that neutral spine position, if those muscles aren't trained to move you through those ranges under load, that's when you're setting yourself up for injury. And so spinal neutral training is a great place to start, but then you have to teach the body to move. Muscles move bones and muscles hold bones in proper alignment. You have to teach the body not only to do their job to hold the bones in proper alignment, but they have to do the proper job to hold the bones in proper alignment through motion. When I bend over to pick up my child, that's an extreme of range of motion, and I need to know that my muscles can tolerate forces in those extremes of range of motion. Because when you have instability, it's instability through motion. We need stability through motion, not stability in a neutral position. And that's what we look at from a muscle activation standpoint, and that's what we look at from an exercise standpoint. You have to make the body comfortable as it gets away from neutral. Because the minute you're not thinking about holding your spine in position and you bend over, the muscles have to contract. They have to contract on demand, and they have to be able to tolerate forces. And so we can't think about it. It just has to happen. And that's what we do with muscle activation techniques is we tighten battery cable. We identify where those altered communication pathways are, and through hands-on stimulation or isometric contractions, we tighten battery cables. We restore the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system so the muscles can contract and contract on demand. So you have to have mobility and stability. You can't just have mobility, because anytime you have mobility without stability, you have vulnerability for injury. But if you provide a sense of stability, i.e. improving the muscles to contract efficiently, tighten battery cables, then the muscles can fully shorten. When the muscles can fully shorten, the tight muscles will relax and allow you to move through your full physiological range, which in turn says now I have mobility because I have stability through that great range. When muscles can contract efficiently, they can fully shorten effectively, and they can tolerate forces through the extremes of range of motion. And that's one of the interesting things is how we train our glutes and abdominals relative to how they function. So with MAT, we basically take an in-depth look at isolated muscle function. I mean, every muscle in the body has its own set of battery cables. So every muscle in the body has a communication pathway between the nervous system and the muscle system. And what we do is we identify where these altered communication pathways are. I always say, I don't care what you can do, I want to know what you can't do. Because what you can't do is breaking you down. So if you can't bend over to rotate and it hurts, or your body's tight and say, oh, I'm tight when I move in this position, or I turn my head to the right and I can turn it there, but oh, when I turn to the left, I can't, it's tight and it hurts. It's because the muscles that move you there can't contract efficiently, so they can't shorten. Then the opposite muscles tighten up, and if you keep forcing the motion, they shout out in pain saying, fix the problem. You got a problem here. The tightness is the first sign of the problem. The pain is the second sign.